At 1:23 in the morning, the men inside control room number 4 believed they were finishing a routine test. Less than a minute later, the reactor beneath them would no longer have a roof. The floor would jump. Steel pipes would twist. Concrete blocks weighing hundreds of tons would be thrown aside, and a column of radioactive fire would rise into the night sky over northern Ukraine. The explosion would be heard across the sleeping city of Pripyat. Windows would tremble. People would step onto balconies. Some would see a strange glow above the power station. Others would watch flames dancing over the roof and assume that the fire brigade would soon bring everything under control. They did not know that the core of a nuclear reactor was open to the atmosphere. They did not know that invisible particles were already falling onto streets, rooftops, trees, playgrounds, and clothing. They did not know that the city they had built their lives around had less than 2 days left. Inside the plant, alarms flashed across the control panels. Men shouted over the noise. The reactor's instruments gave readings that seemed impossible. Some gauges had stopped working. Some cables had been torn apart. The operators could not see the destroyed core from where they stood, and for crucial hours many of them refused to believe what had happened. A reactor, according to everything they had been taught, could not explode. Yet outside, chunks of graphite from the heart of the reactor lay scattered across the ground. Some glowed with heat. Firefighters arrived without protective suits designed for radiation. They climbed onto roofs covered in radioactive debris. They picked up hoses with bare or lightly protected hands. They fought flames they understood while standing beside a danger they could neither see nor smell. Several would begin vomiting before sunrise. Some would describe a metallic taste in their mouths. Their skin would redden as if burned by a sun that had not yet risen. Many had been told only that there was a fire. No one told them they were walking into the exposed remains of Reactor Number 4. This is why Chernobyl cannot be understood as one bad decision made by one reckless man. It was a chain. A reactor designed with dangerous characteristics. A test written without enough attention to nuclear safety. A power grid that delayed the shutdown. A night shift forced into conditions it had not expected. Operators who made serious mistakes. Managers who valued completion over caution. A system that hid problems instead of exposing them. And after the explosion, a government that tried to control information while radiation ignored every border. The disaster began in seconds. But the conditions that created it had been building for years. To understand how a modern city disappeared, how hundreds of thousands of people were pulled into a battle against an invisible enemy, and how one reactor shook the faith of an entire superpower, we must return to the world that created Chernobyl. In the decades after the Second World War, the Soviet Union wanted more than electricity. It wanted proof. Proof that socialism could master nature. Proof that Soviet science could compete with the West. Proof that the same force that had destroyed cities in war could be transformed into a peaceful engine of progress. Across the Soviet Union, enormous industrial projects rose from forests, plains, and river valleys. Dams redirected water. Factories produced steel, chemicals, aircraft, and weapons. Nuclear power stations became symbols of a future that appeared clean, modern, and almost limitless. The official language was confident. The peaceful atom would light cities, power industry, and demonstrate the triumph of science over scarcity. But the Soviet nuclear world developed behind walls of secrecy. Engineers knew what engineers in other facilities were permitted to tell them. Operators were trained according to manuals that did not always reveal the full behavior of the machines they controlled. Design failures could be classified. Accidents could be hidden. Dangerous lessons could remain trapped inside ministries because admitting weakness could damage careers, institutions, and the reputation of the state. Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant was built in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, near the border with Belarus and roughly 100 kilometers north of Kiev. Its official name honored Vladimir Lenin. Its reactors stood beside the Pripyat River, which supplied cooling water and connected the region to the vast Dnieper River system. The nearby city of Pripyat was founded in 1970 for the workers of the plant and their families. It was not an old village that had slowly grown around a factory. It was a planned city built for the nuclear age. Wide avenues crossed between apartment blocks. Schools, shops, sports facilities, cultural centers, clinics, and parks served a young and educated population. Families arrived from across the Soviet Union. Engineers lived beside technicians. Teachers raised children who expected to inherit a better world than their parents had known. The average age of the population was low. The city felt unfinished in the hopeful way of a place still expanding. New buildings were planned. New reactors were under construction. A riverside cafe welcomed visitors. Trees had been planted along the streets, but had not yet grown old. The power station paid relatively well. Its workers held respected positions. For many residents, Pripyat was evidence that the Soviet promise was real. Electricity flowed. Apartments were warm. Children attended modern schools. The future seemed to stand just beyond the next construction crane. At the center of that future was a type of reactor known as the RBMK. The letters came from a Russian name meaning a high-power channel-type reactor. Unlike many reactors in the West, the RBMK used graphite to slow neutrons and water to cool the fuel. Its enormous core contained hundreds of vertical pressure channels. Fuel assemblies sat within those channels. Water passed through them, absorbed heat, turned partly to steam, and helped drive turbines that produced electricity. The design offered major advantages to Soviet planners. It could generate large amounts of power. It could be built from components that Soviet industry could manufacture. It could be refueled while operating. And because it used separate pressure channels instead of one massive pressure vessel, it could be constructed at a scale that suited the ambitions of the state. But the design also carried dangerous characteristics. One of the most important was called the positive void coefficient. The phrase sounds technical, but the basic idea is simple. Inside the reactor, water helped cool the fuel. Water also absorbed some neutrons. When more of that water turned into steam, empty spaces called voids appeared. Steam absorbed fewer neutrons than liquid water. In certain conditions, especially at low power, those extra neutrons could increase the rate of fission. More fission created more heat. More heat created more steam. More steam could create still more fission. Instead of naturally calming itself, the reactor could accelerate. At normal operating power, other physical effects helped limit this behavior. But at low power, under unstable conditions, the positive void effect could dominate. The reactor could become difficult to control, and small changes could produce large consequences. There was another problem. The control rods, which were designed to reduce the nuclear reaction, had a feature that could briefly do the opposite when inserted from a fully withdrawn position. The lower portions of many rods included graphite displacers. When a shutdown began, these graphite sections entered the lower part of the core before the neutron-absorbing material arrived. For a few seconds, they could displace water and increase reactivity in parts of the reactor. The emergency shutdown system was supposed to stop the chain reaction. Under the worst possible conditions, it could begin by adding power. This was not a secret known clearly to the operators in control room number 4 that night. There had already been warning signs in the history of the RBMK design. Earlier incidents had revealed unstable behavior and the possibility of a dangerous positive effect during control rod insertion. But knowledge inside the Soviet nuclear system did not move freely. Information was divided between design bureaus, ministries, plant managers, and state security structures. The people expected to control the reactor did not always receive the full truth about the machine. The RBMK also lacked the kind of massive, full-pressure containment structure used around many other reactor designs. Such a structure could not guarantee that a severe accident would remain harmless, but it could provide another barrier between radioactive material and the outside world. At Chernobyl, when reactor number 4 was destroyed, there was no final shell strong enough to contain what followed. Reactor number 4 entered commercial operation in 1984. It was one of the newest units at the station. 2 years later, the plant prepared to shut it down for routine maintenance. The shutdown offered an opportunity to repeat an electrical test that had failed to produce satisfactory results in earlier attempts. The concern behind the test was real. A nuclear reactor depends on electricity even when it is being shut down. Pumps must continue moving cooling water because the fuel remains hot after the chain reaction stops. If the plant lost its outside electricity supply and the reactor's own turbine stopped producing power, emergency diesel generators would start. But those generators needed time to reach full output. The test asked a practical question. During that short gap, could the turbine, still spinning from momentum, produce enough electricity to power essential cooling pumps until the diesel generators took over? In theory, This was a safety test. In practice, the procedure was prepared and managed as though it belonged mainly to the electrical side of the station. Coordination between the test team and the reactor safety staff was poor. The plan did not fully account for the nuclear dangers of running the RBMK at low power. Some protective systems were to be disabled or bypassed to prevent the test from ending automatically before the measurements were complete. The test had become an objective, and in the industrial culture surrounding the plant, objectives were expected to be completed. On Friday, April 25, 1986, operators began reducing the power of reactor number 4. The process started during the day shift. That was the shift expected to perform the test. Its workers had prepared for it. Specialists were present. The reactor was gradually brought down from full power. Then the regional electrical grid controller made a request. Another source of power was unavailable, and electricity was needed to meet demand. Chernobyl was ordered to delay the shutdown and continue operating at roughly half power. The reactor remained in that condition for hours. The planned schedule began to collapse. The day shift that had expected to run the test moved toward the end of its work. The evening shift inherited the delay. By the time the grid finally allowed the shutdown to continue late that night, the test had been pushed toward the night shift. These operators had not expected to conduct the entire experiment. Some had far less time to study the procedure. The station was tired, the schedule was late, and senior management still expected the test to be completed before maintenance began. The reactor itself had also changed during the delay. Nuclear reactors produce many radioactive substances during operation. One of them, xenon-135, strongly absorbs neutrons. At steady power, its creation and destruction reach a balance. But when power is reduced, xenon can accumulate and suppress the reaction. Operators call this xenon poisoning. As the shutdown continued after 11 o'clock at night, power was supposed to settle at a level suitable for the test. Instead, shortly after midnight, the reactor's power fell dramatically. It dropped to roughly 30 megawatts thermal, far below the intended level. The reactor was now deep in a region of operation where it was unstable and difficult to recover. The safe choice would have been to stop. The test could have been canceled. The reactor could have been shut down and allowed to recover from xenon poisoning over time. But canceling meant failure. It meant explaining why the test had not been completed. It meant losing the opportunity provided by the maintenance shutdown. And so the operators tried to raise the power again. To overcome the neutron-absorbing xenon, they withdrew control rods from the core. More rods came out. Automatic control systems were adjusted. The reactor slowly climbed, but it did not reach the intended test level. It stabilized near 200 megawatts thermal, only a small fraction of full power. This was not the planned condition. It was a dangerous compromise. The reactor was operating with too few control rods effectively inserted. Water flow was high. Steam conditions were unstable. The xenon concentration continued to distort the behavior of the core. Safety margins were shrinking, but the control panels did not present the operators with one clear warning that said disaster was approaching. Instead, they saw dozens of readings, alarms, pressures, flow rates, and signals. They made corrections every few seconds. The reactor responded in complicated ways, and above them stood the expectation that the test would proceed. 00 in the morning, preparations entered their final stage. Additional main circulation pumps were connected. The flow of cooling water through the reactor increased. This reduced steam formation for a time and pushed the reactor towards still more unstable conditions. To keep power from falling, the operators withdrew more control rods. The operational reactivity margin, a measure related to how many rods remained available to control the reactor, fell below the level required by procedure. The reactor should not have been operated in that state. But the full significance of the margin was not clearly displayed to the crew in real time. Calculating it was not as simple as watching one obvious gauge. The rules were not written in a way that fully explained the danger. And the hidden design behavior of the emergency shutdown system remained outside the operator's understanding. Several automatic trip signals had been blocked to prevent the test from being interrupted. Not every disabled system directly caused the explosion, but together they revealed the mindset of the night. The experiment had to run. The machine had to obey. 23:04 a.m., the test began. Steam to the turbine was cut. The turbine started to coast down. As it slowed, the electrical power it supplied to several pumps began to decrease. Water flow through the reactor started to fall. Less water moved through the fuel channels. More water turned to steam. More steam meant more voids. More voids meant more reactivity. The reactor began to increase in power. At first, the rise may not have looked catastrophic. The test was expected to change flows and pressures. The operators continued watching their instruments. Then the feedback accelerated. Inside the core, conditions were not uniform. Some channels were producing far more power than others. Steam formation increased. The positive void effect drove the reaction upward. The reactor was no longer responding like a stable machine. 2340, the emergency shutdown button was pressed. It was known as AZ5. The command sent every control rod downward into the core. In almost any ordinary situation, this should have ended the reaction. But the rods had been withdrawn unusually far. As their graphite displacers entered the lower regions of the reactor, they replaced neutron-absorbing water before the absorbing sections arrived. For a brief moment, the shutdown command increased reactivity in parts of the core. Power surged beyond control. Fuel channels ruptured. Pressure rose violently. The enormous biological shield above the reactor, a structure weighing more than 1,000 tons, was lifted and displaced. The first explosion tore through the reactor. A second explosion followed within seconds. The roof was destroyed. Air rushed into the exposed core. Graphite began to burn. Radioactive fuel fragments, graphite blocks, metal, and concrete were thrown into the open night. The safety test was over. The disaster had begun. In the control room, the men heard the explosions and felt the building move. Ceiling panels fell. Dust filled the air. Lights failed. Alarms sounded across the boards. For a moment, no one could understand what had happened. The operators had seen emergencies in training. They knew about broken pipes, pump failures, electrical faults, fires, and sudden shutdowns. They had no procedure for a reactor that no longer existed in recognizable form. Alexander Akimov, the shift supervisor, tried to establish the condition of the reactor. Leonid Topchinov, the young senior reactor control engineer, watched instruments that no longer made sense. Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer overseeing the test, attempted to impose order. Water had to be restored to the reactor. That became the immediate assumption. If the core was intact, but losing coolant, pumping water could save it. Men were sent into damaged corridors to operate valves by hand. Others tried to start pumps. They stepped through water and debris. Radiation fields in parts of the building were already lethal. The belief that the reactor was still intact shaped the response. It was psychologically easier to believe that instruments were wrong than to accept that a machine considered incapable of exploding had blown itself apart. Outside, one of the plant workers, Valery Kodymchuk, had been near the main circulation pumps when the explosion destroyed the area. His body was never recovered. Another worker, Vladimir Shashanok, suffered devastating burns and injuries and died later that morning. They were the first deaths. They would not be the last. The first fire alarm reached the station's own brigade within minutes. Firefighters arrived from Pripyat soon afterward. Their mission appeared clear: stop the flames from spreading to reactor number 3 and the turbine hall. If the fire reached neighboring systems, the disaster could grow even larger. The firefighters did what they had been trained to do. They climbed. They dragged hoses across roofs. They moved toward heat and smoke. But this was not an ordinary industrial fire. The black blocks scattered around them were not harmless pieces of construction material. They were graphite from inside the reactor core. The shining fragments mixed with rubble were pieces of nuclear fuel and intensely radioactive material. Radiation meters at the plant were either incapable of measuring the highest levels, unavailable, damaged, or misunderstood. Some instruments gave readings at their maximum scale, which encouraged the false hope that the true dose might not be much higher. In reality, some locations near the destroyed reactor were delivering fatal doses within minutes. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik and other firefighters moved onto the roofs. They fought burning bitumen and debris. Their work helped prevent conventional fires from spreading across the complex. They succeeded in a task that may have saved additional units. But the cost was terrible. Radiation does not announce itself with a roar. It does not push a person backward. A firefighter could stand in a deadly field and feel almost nothing at first. Then came nausea, weakness, dizziness, a strange taste, skin that seemed burned. Some men continued working even after symptoms appeared. Others were carried or driven away. Many believed they had been exposed to smoke or chemicals. Few understood the scale of the radiation entering their bodies. By around 5 in the morning, the major fires on the roofs had been brought under control. The exposed graphite inside the ruined reactor continued burning. Above the station, a plume carried radioactive material into the atmosphere. The wind began moving it northwest. Pripyat was less than 3 kilometers away. The city was waking up, and no evacuation order had been given. Saturday morning arrived in Pripyat beneath a clear spring sky. The city looked almost normal. Buses moved through the streets. Parents prepared breakfast. Children played outside. Weddings were planned. Shops opened. Fishermen went toward the river. From some apartment windows, residents could see smoke rising from the plant. Rumors moved faster than official information. There had been a fire. There had been an explosion. Someone had been hurt. The authorities would handle it. The power station was the reason Pripyat existed, and confidence in the station was woven into the city's identity. Many residents had family members who worked there. They knew that nuclear power was treated as a field of elite science and strict control. The idea that the city itself might be in danger seemed too extreme to accept. Radiation survey teams were already finding alarming levels. Yet the streets remained open. Children continued playing in courtyards where radioactive dust was settling. People stood on balconies to watch the distant smoke. Some residents walked closer to the plant for a better view. The city's hospital began receiving injured workers and firefighters, but the public was not told what those injuries meant. The danger was made worse by the ordinary appearance of everything. There was no wall of flame moving toward the city, no invading army, no flood rising through the streets. The enemy was invisible. Radioactive iodine entered the air and later the food supply. Cesium and other radionuclides settled unevenly, depending on wind and rain. A street could be more contaminated than the next one. A patch of grass could hold more danger than a nearby road. People could not judge the risk with their senses. Only instruments could reveal it. And the people with the instruments were part of a system that had not yet decided what truth could be spoken. At the plant, the first hours after sunrise were filled with confusion, exposure, and denial. Managers tried to understand the scale of the accident while reports moved upward through the Soviet chain of command. Some accounts minimized what had happened. A fire had occurred. The reactor was being cooled. Radiation conditions were under control. But men sent into the building returned with evidence that contradicted those claims. There was no intact reactor to cool. From certain positions, the destroyed core could be seen open to the sky. Chunks of graphite outside the building could only have come from inside it. Radiation readings rose far beyond normal emergency levels. Still, accepting the destruction of the reactor meant accepting something that official doctrine had treated as impossible. It also meant admitting that the plant, the reactor design, and the system responsible for both had failed in the most public way imaginable. The truth climbed the hierarchy slowly. Radiation moved without waiting. The injured were taken first to the hospital in Pripyat. Medical staff worked under conditions of uncertainty. Some patients had conventional burns and trauma. Others had received massive radiation doses. Their clothing and bodies could contaminate rooms, equipment, and the people trying to help them. Doctors and nurses removed clothes, washed skin, treated wounds, and tried to separate those with the most serious symptoms. Many of the firefighters were young, physically strong men who had arrived at the station expecting a difficult night and believed they would soon return home. Instead, their bodies began to fail in ways that few people around them had ever seen. Acute radiation syndrome develops according to dose. At very high exposure, cells that divide rapidly are damaged first. The lining of the digestive system, bone marrow, skin, and other tissues can be devastated. Early nausea and vomiting may be followed by a deceptive period when the patient seems to improve. Then infection, bleeding, organ failure, and severe burns can appear. The delay between exposure and collapse can create false hope. A man can speak. He can walk. He can believe he is recovering. Inside him, the damage may already be irreversible. Many of the most heavily exposed firefighters and plant workers were later transferred to specialized Hospital No. 6 in Moscow. There, medical teams with experience in radiation injury attempted treatments that included isolation, antibiotics, transfusions, and in selected cases bone marrow procedures. Families followed with little information. Wives and parents faced barriers, warnings, and uncertainty. Some patients could be visited only under strict conditions. Their bodies had been exposed to radiation, but it was important to distinguish exposure from contamination. A person who has absorbed radiation is not automatically a source of radiation to others. Yet contaminated clothing, dust, and particles could spread material, and fear often blurred the difference. In later years, stories from those hospital rooms would become part of the emotional memory of Chernobyl. Some were documented. Others were repeated, simplified, or dramatized. The real suffering required no invention. Men who had entered the night believing they were fighting a roof fire died within weeks. The city they had tried to protect was already being prepared for abandonment. By the afternoon of April 26th, a government commission was moving toward Chernobyl. Among its members was Valery Legasov, a senior scientist from the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. He was not the designer of the RBMK reactor, but he had the authority, knowledge, and political position to help evaluate the disaster. When the commission arrived, the evidence was overwhelming. Radiation levels were severe. The reactor was destroyed. The graphite fire and exposed fuel were releasing enormous quantities of radioactive material. Pripyat could not safely remain occupied. Even then, evacuation was not immediate. Officials debated measurements, routes, transport, and the danger of panic. In a political system built around control, a mass evacuation was not only a public safety decision. It was an admission. Nearly 50,000 people could not disappear from a model Soviet city without questions. The commission needed buses. Thousands of them. During the night of April 26th and the early hours of April 27th, buses were assembled from Kyiv and surrounding areas. Drivers were told to report for an emergency operation. A long line of vehicles stretched along roads leading toward Pripyat. Most residents still did not know they would soon leave their homes. On Sunday morning, the city remained outwardly calm. Loudspeakers finally carried the official announcement in the early afternoon. Residents were told that an unfavorable radiation situation had developed at the Chernobyl nuclear power station. As a temporary precaution, they would be evacuated to nearby settlements. They were instructed to bring identification, essential belongings, and food for a short period. They were told to turn off electricity and gas, close windows, and remain calm. The key word was temporary. People believed they would return in a few days. They packed lightly. A change of clothes, documents, some food, a child's favorite object. Many left photographs, furniture, books, tools, and family possessions behind. Pets were often left in apartments or courtyards because the evacuation announcement did not prepare residents for permanent separation. By mid-afternoon, buses began filling. Families waited outside apartment buildings. Police and officials directed them toward assigned vehicles. Elderly residents carried small bags. Parents held children by the hand. Workers looked back toward the plant, where helicopters had begun flying over the smoking ruin. The evacuation was organized with remarkable speed once the decision was made. In a matter of hours, almost the entire population of Pripyat was removed. But the city had already remained exposed for roughly 36 hours after the explosion. That delay mattered. It allowed people to breathe contaminated air, stand outdoors, and consume food and water without adequate warning. It also became one of the clearest symbols of the Soviet response. The machinery of the state could mobilize thousands of buses, soldiers, police, doctors, and engineers, yet it struggled to tell ordinary people the truth in time. As the buses pulled away, residents saw familiar streets through the windows. The amusement park that had not yet officially opened. School buildings. The Palace of Culture. The stadium. Apartment balconies with laundry still hanging. Many expected to see them again before the week ended. Most never returned to live there. The buses carried them beyond the city while military vehicles and radiation teams moved in the opposite direction. Pripyat was becoming a closed zone. A city built for the future had reached the end of its ordinary life after only 16 years. The evacuation did not end the danger. It revealed how large the response would have to become. The destroyed reactor was still releasing radioactive material. The graphite moderator burned at extremely high temperatures. Fuel inside the ruins continued to heat, melt, and rearrange itself. No one knew with certainty what was happening beneath the smoke. There were fears of new explosions. Water had accumulated in lower areas of the building from broken pipes and firefighting efforts. Officials worried that molten fuel might reach it and cause a powerful steam event. Engineers also feared contamination of groundwater and the river system. The Soviet state began assembling an army against the reactor. Helicopter crews flew over the open core and dropped materials into the crater. Boron compounds were intended to absorb neutrons. Sand and clay were meant to smother fire and trap particles. Dolomite was expected to absorb heat and release carbon dioxide. Lead was included in the hope that it would help shield radiation. The missions were dangerous and imprecise. Pilots had to approach a column of heat, smoke, and radiation. Early methods required hovering near the reactor, exposing crews to high dose rates. Later drops were made while moving. The air above the core was turbulent. Loads missed the target. Some materials struck damaged structures and may have spread contamination or trapped heat. From the ground, the helicopters appeared heroic. And they were. But heroism did not guarantee that every decision was correct. Chernobyl forced people to act before they fully understood the condition of the reactor. Every option carried risk. Doing nothing allowed the release to continue. Acting aggressively could make the situation worse. This uncertainty defined the response. Teams drilled, measured, calculated, and argued while the core changed beneath them. Miners were brought from across the Soviet Union to dig a tunnel beneath Reactor Number 4. The plan was to create space for a cooling system or protective barrier below the reactor, in case molten material continued downward. The work was brutal. The tunnel was hot, poorly ventilated, and difficult to complete with heavy protective equipment. Men worked in shifts, pushing through soil beneath a building filled with radioactive debris. Their labor became one of the most famous episodes of the cleanup. Later evidence suggested that the feared scenario did not unfold exactly as officials imagined, and that the cooling system was not used as originally planned. But this does not make the miners' work meaningless. At the time, no one could safely assume the danger had passed. They dug, because the possible consequence of doing nothing seemed worse. Elsewhere, water beneath the reactor had to be managed. Plant workers entered hazardous areas to open valves and drain sections of the building. Popular retellings sometimes describe these men as certain to die almost immediately. In reality, several survived for many years. Their mission was still dangerous, and their willingness to enter the damaged complex remains extraordinary. Chernobyl's history is filled with moments like this. The truth is dramatic enough. It does not need every participant to die for courage to be real. On April 28, 2 days after the explosion, workers at the Forsmark Nuclear Power Plant in Sweden passed through radiation monitors and triggered alarms. At first, the Swedish staff suspected a leak at their own facility. They searched the plant and found no source. Analysis of the contamination and weather patterns pointed east, toward the Soviet Union. Other countries began detecting unusual radiation. The accident could no longer remain a domestic secret. Radioactive material had crossed borders that Soviet officials could control only on maps. That evening, Soviet television broadcast a brief announcement. An accident had occurred at the Chernobyl Nuclear Power Plant. One reactor had been damaged. Measures were being taken. Assistance was being provided. The statement gave almost no sense of the scale. By then, a reactor had been destroyed, Pripyat had been evacuated, firefighters were critically ill, and radioactive fallout was moving across Europe. The delay damaged trust far beyond the immediate disaster. Neighboring countries wanted data about the release. Citizens across Europe feared contaminated rain, food, milk, and soil. Governments issued different recommendations. Some restricted produce. Some warned children to remain indoors. Measurements varied widely by region because fallout followed changing winds and rain patterns. The uncertainty created fear. Radiation is difficult for the public to understand even when information is open. It becomes far more frightening when governments appear to hide what they know. The Soviet Union had spent decades presenting nuclear technology as controlled and safe. Now other nations had discovered the accident through contaminated clothing at a Swedish plant. The political meaning was impossible to contain. Inside the Soviet Union, information remained limited. Public celebrations for May Day approached. In Kyiv and other cities, parades continued despite concern about radioactive fallout. Officials feared panic and the political consequences of cancellation. For families, the contrast was unbearable. Children marched beneath banners while parents heard rumors of invisible poison. Train stations became crowded. Pharmacies ran out of iodine products as people tried to protect themselves without reliable guidance. Some took inappropriate substances or dangerous amounts. Others sent children away if they could. Stable iodine can reduce the thyroid's absorption of radioactive iodine when given correctly and at the right time. But protection requires planning, trusted communication, and proper dosing. Across many affected areas, especially those where contaminated milk was consumed, these protections came too late or not at all. The result would appear years later in increased thyroid cancers among people exposed as children or adolescents. The most heavily contaminated regions were not limited to the immediate surroundings of the plant. Belarus, lying north of Chernobyl, received a major share of the fallout. Parts of Ukraine and Russia were also contaminated. Rain created hotspots far from the reactor. Villages that looked untouched could receive serious deposition. Other areas closer to the plant were less affected than expected. Radiation did not spread in a perfect circle. It followed weather. This made the map of contamination irregular and cruel. One community might remain. Another might be evacuated. One family might continue farming. Another might be told that its land, animals, food, and home were unsafe. In 1986, about 115,000 people were evacuated from the most affected areas. In later years, hundreds of thousands more were relocated from contaminated regions in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. Every relocation carried more than a radiation dose. It carried the loss of place. Villages emptied. Communities broke apart. People were moved into unfamiliar housing and sometimes treated as contaminated outsiders. Older residents struggled to adapt. Farmers lost land their families had worked for generations. Children grew up under a name that could produce fear wherever they went. Chernobyl became both a physical disaster and a social identity. The word followed evacuees into schools, workplaces, hospitals, and marriages. Some were called victims. Some were treated as dangerous. Some were promised support that later weakened as the Soviet Union collapsed. Some returned illegally to their villages because the emotional cost of exile felt greater than the risk of radiation. These returnees would later be known as self-settlers. They repaired old houses, planted gardens, kept animals, and lived inside the exclusion zone. Their decisions were not evidence that radiation was harmless. They were evidence that human beings measure danger in more than one way. To an elderly person, losing a homeland can feel more immediate than a statistical increase in future cancer risk. To a government, relocation can appear as a line on a map. To the person being moved, it can feel like the destruction of a world. Meanwhile, the Soviet response expanded into one of the largest emergency mobilizations in modern history. The people sent to contain and clean the disaster became known as liquidators. They included soldiers, firefighters, engineers, construction workers, miners, pilots, drivers, doctors, scientists, police, and civilian specialists. Some volunteered. Some were assigned. Some understood the danger. Many did not. Their missions varied enormously. A person working far from the reactor might receive a relatively low dose. A man sent onto a highly contaminated roof could receive a dangerous dose in less than a minute. The word liquidator sounds cold and bureaucratic. The work was anything but abstract. They washed buildings, removed soil, cut down forests, buried equipment, killed abandoned animals to prevent contamination from spreading, built roads, measured radiation, collected debris, constructed barriers, and slowly transformed the area around Reactor Number 4 into a landscape of checkpoints, trenches, machines, and temporary camps. The first objective had been to stop the fire and reduce the release. The next would be even larger. The ruins had to be sealed. But before a structure could rise around the reactor, the land and buildings surrounding it had to be made survivable enough for construction crews to approach. That meant sending human beings into places where machines often failed. And the most dangerous of those places were waiting on the rooftops. The roofs around Reactor Number 4 had become fields of radioactive debris. The explosions had thrown pieces of graphite, fuel, concrete, and metal across the neighboring structures. Some fragments were small enough to lift by hand. Others were heavy blocks. All had to be removed before workers could safely build the containment structure planned around the ruins. At first, officials hoped robots would do the most dangerous work. Machines were brought from the Soviet Union and other countries. Remote-controlled vehicles were sent onto the roofs to push debris toward openings where it could fall back into the destroyed reactor building. But Chernobyl defeated many of them. Electronics failed in the intense radiation. Cameras broke down. Controls became unreliable. Machines stopped moving in places where retrieving them was itself dangerous. The state had built rockets, submarines, tanks, and nuclear reactors. Yet on the roof of Reactor Number 4, some of its most advanced equipment became useless. The remaining solution was human. Soldiers were selected for brief missions on the most contaminated roofs. They wore improvised protection, heavy clothing, gloves, respirators, boots, and sheets of lead strapped around the body. The equipment looked protective, but it could not stop the strongest gamma radiation. It could reduce contamination and shield certain areas slightly. It could not make the roof safe. The men were given simple instructions. Run out. Find a piece of debris. Lift or shovel it. Throw it over the edge into the reactor ruin. Return immediately. In some areas, the allowed time was measured in seconds. A soldier might wait behind cover, hearing the signal and watching the man ahead of him disappear through the doorway. Then his turn came. He stepped into daylight. The roof was broken and uneven. Rubble caught under boots. Dust rose with every movement. Radiation could not be seen, but the urgency of the commanders told him it was everywhere. He had perhaps 40 seconds, perhaps less. He chose a fragment, forced it onto a shovel, moved toward the edge, threw it, and ran back. Then another man went. Because they replaced machines, these workers were sometimes called biorobots. The name captured the brutality of the task. A robot could be abandoned when its electronics failed. A human being carried the exposure home. Not every roof mission resulted in catastrophic illness. Doses varied, records were imperfect, and many participants survived for decades. But the work placed men into environments that should never have required a human presence. They entered because the disaster had already passed beyond the limits of the equipment available to contain it. Across the zone, other liquidators attacked contamination by removing the world itself. Topsoil was scraped away and buried. Roofs were washed. Roads were sprayed. Trees were cut down. Vehicles too contaminated to use safely were left in storage areas or buried. Entire villages were demolished and covered with earth. Signs marked radiation levels that could change over short distances. The pine forest west of the plant absorbed an enormous amount of fallout. Many trees died and turned reddish-brown, creating the area later called the Red Forest. Crews cut and buried contaminated vegetation and soil in an attempt to reduce the spread of radioactive particles. The landscape became a vast engineering problem. Every object could hold contamination. A truck tire could carry dust beyond a checkpoint. A uniform could expose a family. A patch of soil could be safe enough for brief work, while another nearby required immediate retreat. Dosimeters became essential, but not every worker received accurate or complete information. Records could be missing, estimated, or adjusted. Some men were rotated out after reaching official limits. Others believed their true exposure was higher than the number written in their files. This uncertainty would haunt many liquidators long after the work ended. A dose is not only a measurement. It can determine medical status, compensation, and whether illness is recognized as connected to service. When records are unreliable, people can be left fighting not only disease, but bureaucracy. The cleanup also required killing abandoned domestic animals in evacuated settlements. Dogs and cats left behind in Pripyat and nearby villages moved through contaminated areas. Officials feared they could carry radioactive material beyond the zone or form uncontrolled populations. Teams were ordered to shoot them and bury the bodies. For the men assigned, it was a different kind of horror. The animals often approached vehicles expecting their owners to return. Chernobyl had transformed familiar acts into dangerous ones. Touching a pet, drinking milk, picking berries, standing in rain, opening a window. The disaster entered daily life by turning ordinary things into possible sources of exposure. While crews cleared the site, engineers designed a structure to enclose reactor number 4. It became known as the sarcophagus. The name suggested a tomb, but the reactor was not dead. Inside the ruins remained nuclear fuel, molten materials, radioactive dust, graphite, water, concrete, and unstable structures. Some areas were too dangerous to inspect directly. Plans had to be based on incomplete measurements and remote observation. Construction began under extreme time pressure. The goal was to reduce radioactive releases, protect workers at the other reactors, and create a barrier before winter weather spread more contamination. Massive concrete walls were built around the ruin. Steel beams were placed across damaged structures. Sections of the surviving building were used as supports even though their condition was uncertain. Cranes operated from prepared areas. Workers assembled components in less contaminated locations and moved them into place. No one could build such a structure in the ordinary way. A crew could not simply remain beside the reactor all day. Exposure had to be managed through distance, shielding, and time. Jobs were divided into short operations. Equipment was positioned with care. Cameras and radiation instruments guided work where human access was impossible. By late 1986, only months after the explosion, the first shelter stood around the remains of reactor number 4. It was an extraordinary construction achievement. It was also temporary from the moment it was completed. The sarcophagus had been built quickly around a ruin that could not be fully surveyed. It contained gaps. It depended partly on damaged structures. Water could enter. Dust could escape. Corrosion and instability threatened its future. But it gave the world time. Outside the shelter, life at the plant did not end. Reactors 1, 2, and 3 had not been destroyed. After decontamination and political debate, they returned to operation at different times. Thousands of workers were still needed to maintain the station, monitor the damaged unit, and support the cleanup. A new city, Slavutic, was built to house many of them. It rose outside the exclusion zone with districts designed by architects from several Soviet republics. In this way, the Soviet Union answered the death of one planned city by building another. But Slavutic could not replace Pripyat. A city is more than apartments and roads. It is memory attached to place. For former residents, Pripyat remained frozen at the moment of departure. School books lay on floors. Toys remained in rooms. Calendars stopped in 1986. Trees pushed through pavement. Rain entered broken buildings. Paint peeled from walls that had once represented modern progress. Over time, photographs of the abandoned city would become some of the most recognizable images of the disaster. Yet those images can mislead. Pripyat was not instantly transformed into the ruin seen decades later. Evacuation did not scatter every object into dramatic positions. Weather, decay, official activity, vandalism, tourism, and looting changed the city. Some famous scenes reflect years of abandonment rather than the exact moment residents left. The real loss was quieter. A key that no longer opened a usable home. A family photograph left in a drawer. A garden that could not be harvested. A grave that relatives needed permission to visit. A child who remembered only fragments of the city where he was born. As the physical cleanup continued, the Soviet government faced another task, explaining the accident. In August 1986, Soviet experts presented a report to an international meeting in Vienna. The early official account placed heavy blame on the operators. They had violated procedures. They had disabled protections. They had run the reactor in an unsafe state. Those statements contained truth. The crew did make serious errors. They continued a test that should have been stopped. They operated with an insufficient control margin. They bypassed or disabled systems. They failed to understand the danger of the reactor's condition. But the explanation was incomplete. It did not give equal weight to the design flaws that made those errors catastrophic. It did not fully reveal that the emergency shutdown system itself could create a positive reactivity surge. It did not explain how poorly the operating documentation communicated the danger of low-power conditions. It did not expose the deeper failures of regulation, design review, information sharing, and safety culture. Blaming individuals protected institutions. The men in the control room were visible. The system behind them was enormous and difficult to put on trial. In July 1987, several Chernobyl officials and operators were prosecuted. The trial took place in the closed city of Chernobyl. Among the defendants were plant director Viktor Burkinov, Chief Engineer Nikolai Fomin, and Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. They received prison sentences. The trial reinforced the story that the disaster resulted from violations and poor management at one plant. Again, this was not entirely false. But it was not enough. A safe system must be designed with the expectation that people will make mistakes. Warnings must be clear. Emergency systems must not contain hidden behaviors that can intensify an accident. Regulators must be independent enough to challenge designers and managers. Information about earlier failures must reach the people operating similar machines. At Chernobyl, those protections failed together. Later investigations, including a revised international assessment published years afterward, shifted more attention toward the reactor's design and the broader absence of safety culture. That phrase, safety culture, became one of Chernobyl's most important legacies. It means more than following rules. It means creating an environment where safety has priority over production, schedule, reputation, and authority. It means a junior operator can question a dangerous decision. It means a manager can cancel a test without fearing punishment for delay. It means designers disclose weaknesses. It means institutions learn from accidents instead of hiding them. It means uncertainty is treated as a warning, not an inconvenience. Chernobyl was not created by a total absence of intelligent people. The plant was filled with trained specialists. The response involved brilliant scientists and engineers. The Soviet Union possessed enormous technical capability. The disaster showed that expertise can be defeated when institutions punish honesty and reward obedience. Valery Legasov became central to the struggle over how Chernobyl would be remembered. He worked on the government commission, spent significant time at the site, and helped present the Soviet account internationally. He saw both the physical devastation and the deeper problems of the nuclear system. Legasov was not a simple hero standing outside that system. He was part of it. He defended some official positions and participated in compromises. But he also pushed for greater recognition of design failures and the culture that allowed them to remain hidden. The pressure was immense. The disaster damaged his health and isolated him professionally. On April 27, 1988, 2 years and 1 day after the evacuation of Pripyat, Legasov died by suicide. Before his death, he recorded reflections on the accident and the state of Soviet nuclear safety. The exact influence of those recordings is sometimes exaggerated in popular retellings, but his death became inseparable from Chernobyl's moral meaning. The central question was no longer only why the reactor exploded. It was why so many people had been unable to speak openly before it did. The answer reached beyond nuclear engineering. The Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev had already begun discussing glasnost, a policy of greater openness. Chernobyl exposed how urgently openness was needed and how dangerous secrecy could be. The accident forced the government to release information under international pressure. Journalists demanded answers. Citizens questioned official statements. Scientists pushed for reform. The cost of the cleanup strained the economy. The evacuation and contamination affected several Soviet republics, especially Ukraine and Belarus, strengthening anger toward Moscow. Gorbachev later suggested that Chernobyl may have been one of the events that accelerated the collapse of the Soviet Union more than his own reforms did. It would be too simple to say one reactor destroyed a superpower. The Soviet Union faced economic stagnation, political conflict, nationalism, military costs, and structural problems far larger than Chernobyl alone. But the disaster became a symbol of those problems. A state that claimed scientific mastery had lost control of a reactor. A government that claimed to protect its people had delayed warning them. A system built on secrecy had been exposed by radiation monitors in another country. Chernobyl did not create every weakness of the Soviet Union. It made them visible. And visibility can be fatal to a system that depends on belief. The political story, however, can overshadow the more difficult question of human health. How many people did Chernobyl kill? The answer depends on what is being counted, over what period, among which populations, and by what scientific method. 2 workers died as a direct result of the explosion and immediate injuries. 28 of the most heavily exposed emergency workers and plant personnel died from acute radiation syndrome within the first months. Other early deaths and later illnesses are discussed differently across sources and classifications. Beyond those immediate cases, the numbers become harder to measure. Radiation can increase cancer risk, but cancer is common even without a nuclear accident. When millions of people receive varying doses, scientists cannot examine an individual tumor and always determine whether it was caused by Chernobyl. They must compare populations, estimate doses, follow health outcomes over decades, and separate radiation effects from smoking, alcohol use, poverty, medical care, stress, aging, and other factors. Different groups use different assumptions. Some estimates focus only on effects demonstrated clearly in epidemiological data. Others use risk models to project additional cancer deaths that may be statistically real but impossible to identify, person by person. Still others include broader social, economic, and psychological damage. This is why estimates can differ so sharply. Uncertainty does not mean nothing happened. It means the truth cannot be reduced honestly to one dramatic number without explanation. The clearest long-term radiation-related health effect has been the increase in thyroid cancer among those exposed as children and adolescents, especially in the most affected regions. Radioactive iodine entered the food chain, particularly through contaminated milk. The thyroid gland absorbs iodine as part of its normal function. In growing children, that made the gland especially vulnerable. Thousands of thyroid cancer cases were later diagnosed among people who had been young at the time of the accident. Many were treated successfully, but successful treatment does not erase surgery, fear, lifelong monitoring, or the deaths that did occur. The tragedy is sharpened by the fact that much of this exposure could have been reduced. Early warnings, food controls, distribution of stable iodine, and removal of contaminated milk could have protected many children. The reactor explosion was sudden. The failure to protect the public afterward was not entirely unavoidable. For liquidators, the picture is complex. Hundreds of thousands participated over several years, with doses ranging from low to extremely high. Studies have examined leukemia, cataracts, cardiovascular disease, solid cancers, and other outcomes. Some increases have been found in particular groups, while other suspected effects remain uncertain or difficult to prove. The scientific debate continues because the records are incomplete and the exposed population is diverse. But the liquidators' suffering was not limited to diseases that could be confirmed statistically. Many returned home with anxiety, physical symptoms, and uncertain dose records. They entered medical systems that sometimes recognized them and sometimes dismissed them. After the Soviet collapse, compensation programs changed. Economic crisis weakened care. Men who had once been praised as heroes could find themselves struggling for medicine, status, and proof. Chernobyl also produced deep psychological and social damage. People were told that their homes, food, bodies, and children might be contaminated. Some were labeled invalids or victims for life. Communities experienced depression, alcoholism, family stress, unemployment, and a loss of control over the future. Fear of radiation could itself become a health burden. This creates a difficult moral balance. Officials should never minimize real exposure, but they should also avoid telling entire populations that they are permanently damaged when the evidence does not support it. After Chernobyl, both failures occurred. Some authorities hid danger. Some later messages made people believe that any contact with the affected regions meant inevitable illness. The result was mistrust from both directions. For many survivors, the question was never only, what dose did I receive? It was, why was I not told? Why was my child allowed to drink the milk? Why was my village evacuated while another remained? Why does one doctor recognize my illness, while another says it has nothing to do with Chernobyl? Why do official numbers change? Why should I trust the same institutions that once denied the scale of the accident? Science can estimate risk. It cannot repair betrayal by itself. Years passed, and the exclusion zone began to change. At first, it was a landscape of emergency. Roadblocks controlled movement. Military vehicles crossed contaminated roads. Workers lived in temporary quarters. Warning signs stood beside abandoned villages. The plant remained active. The sarcophagus loomed over Reactor Number 4 like a rough concrete cliff. Then the urgency became routine. Radiation monitoring continued. Waste sites were managed. Buildings were inspected. Scientists entered forests, wetlands, and fields to study contamination. Workers traveled into the zone according to controlled schedules and returned to homes outside it. Nature moved into the space people had left behind. Plants split pavement. Trees grew through schoolyards. Wild animals crossed roads once crowded with buses. Wolves, wild boar, deer, elk, foxes, and many bird species were observed in the region. This led to a powerful and sometimes misleading story. Nature had defeated radiation. The truth is more complicated. The absence of dense human settlement, farming, traffic, hunting, and industry created opportunities for wildlife. At the same time, radiation did not vanish. Its effects varied by species, location, dose, and generation. Some studies found biological damage in highly contaminated areas. Others documented healthy or growing animal populations across much of the zone. Both can be true. The exclusion zone is not proof that radiation is harmless. It is proof that human pressure and radioactive contamination affect ecosystems in different ways, and that removing one danger can allow life to expand even while another remains. The zone became a living laboratory with no true control experiment. Every observation carried questions. Were animals thriving because people were absent? Were hidden genetic or reproductive effects occurring? Did populations move between cleaner and more contaminated regions? How should scientists separate radiation from habitat change, disease, weather, and normal variation? Chernobyl continued to resist simple answers. Inside the sarcophagus, the ruined reactor was changing too. During the accident, fuel, metal, sand, concrete, and other materials melted and combined into lava-like substances. These flows moved through lower parts of the building and hardened into strange formations. The most famous became known as the elephant's foot because of its wrinkled, massive shape. When first discovered, it was intensely radioactive. Brief exposure near it could deliver a severe dose. Researchers used remote cameras, mirrors, improvised devices, and short visits to study it. The elephant's foot became an icon of nuclear horror. But it was not a supernatural object. A mixture created when reactor fuel and structural materials melted together. Its existence revealed how far the accident had progressed beyond the initial explosions. The fuel had not remained neatly inside rods or channels. It had become part of a new material spread through rooms and passages beneath the reactor. Over time, radiation levels declined as shorter-lived isotopes decayed. But the fuel-containing materials did not become safe. They cracked, produced dust, interacted with water, and remained a long-term engineering challenge. The first sarcophagus protected the environment, but it also made access difficult. Workers needed a better structure if they were ever to dismantle unstable sections and manage the radioactive material inside. The Soviet Union did not survive long enough to complete that task. In 1991, the country dissolved. Chernobyl became the responsibility of an independent Ukraine already facing economic crisis. Belarus and Russia managed their own contaminated territories and affected populations. The centralized system that had mobilized the cleanup disappeared, but the reactor remained. International cooperation became essential. The shelter needed stabilization. The undamaged reactors had to be shut down and decommissioned. Spent fuel required storage. Radioactive waste needed secure handling. The site demanded decades of work that no single government could easily finance. Reactor number 2 had already been damaged by a fire in 1991 and did not return to operation. Reactor number 1 closed in 1996. Reactor number 3, the last operating unit at Chernobyl, shut down in December 2000. When its controls were turned for the final time, the Chernobyl plant stopped producing electricity. But shutdown did not mean completion. A nuclear power plant does not disappear when the turbines stop. Fuel must be removed. Systems must be maintained. Contaminated structures must be dismantled. Waste must be stored. Radiation must be monitored for generations. The end of power production was only the beginning of decommissioning. By the 1990s, concern over the original sarcophagus had grown. It had been designed under emergency conditions, not as a permanent solution. Rain and snow entered through openings. Steel corroded. Dust accumulated. Some structural elements depended on damaged portions of the old reactor building. A collapse could release radioactive dust and make future work far more dangerous. The answer was one of the largest engineering structures ever moved across land. The new safe confinement was designed as a giant steel arch large enough to cover the original shelter and the remains of reactor number 4. It could not be built directly above the reactor because radiation levels would expose construction crews. Instead, the arch was assembled in sections at a safer distance. The scale was extraordinary. It rose more than 100 meters high. Its span exceeded 250 meters. Fully equipped, it weighed tens of thousands of tons. Inside, remote crane systems were installed to help dismantle unstable structures and handle radioactive material. In 2016, 3 decades after the explosion, the completed arch began moving. Hydraulic systems pushed it slowly along tracks for more than 300 meters. The structure advanced over the old sarcophagus until reactor number 4 disappeared beneath it. The movement took days. The planning had taken years. The disaster had taken seconds. After testing and commissioning, the new safe confinement was formally handed over in 2019. It was designed not as a final tomb, but as a working environment for the next stage, controlling dust, protecting the ruins from weather, dismantling unstable structures, and eventually managing the fuel-containing material. The arch gave engineers another window of time. It did not erase the reactor. Chernobyl has always been a story of buying time. The firefighters bought time for the neighboring units. The helicopter crews bought time while the core burned. The miners and plant workers acted against feared scenarios before they could be understood. The liquidators bought time by clearing roofs and soil. The sarcophagus bought time for a collapsing Soviet Union. The new safe confinement bought time for future generations to solve what 1986 left behind. Every barrier at Chernobyl is a promise made to people who have not yet been born. The accident also changed nuclear power far beyond the Soviet Union. RBMK reactors were modified. Control rods were redesigned to reduce the dangerous positive effect during insertion. Operating procedures changed. Minimum control margins were increased. Fuel enrichment and other technical measures were adjusted to make the reactors more stable. Training improved. International review became more important. The disaster helped produce new agreements for early notification and international assistance during nuclear accidents. It encouraged greater exchange of safety information across borders. Nuclear operators recognized that an accident in one country could affect public trust in every country. Chernobyl had demonstrated that secrecy was not only unethical, it was technically dangerous. When information about failures is hidden, the same failure can happen again. When emergency data is delayed, neighboring nations lose time. When operators do not know the true behavior of their machine, procedures become traps. Many nuclear professionals drew lessons from Chernobyl that improved reactor operations around the world. The accident also strengthened opposition to nuclear power. Public protests grew. Some countries slowed or canceled programs. Others changed regulations. For millions of people, the word nuclear became inseparable from images of abandoned apartments, sick firefighters, and a broken reactor. Supporters of nuclear energy argued that the RBMK design and Soviet safety system were unusual and that modern reactors with strong containment and different physical characteristics should not be judged as though every plant were Chernobyl. Critics answered that every complex technology can fail in ways its designers do not expect, especially when institutions become overconfident. The debate continues because Chernobyl supports more than one warning. It warns against dangerous reactor design. It warns against human error. It warns against weak regulation. It warns against secrecy. It warns against assuming that low-probability events can be ignored. And it warns that the consequences of energy decisions can last longer than the governments that make them. In 2011, another nuclear disaster at Fukushima Daiichi in Japan revived comparisons with Chernobyl. Both accidents reached the highest level on the international nuclear event scale. Both forced mass evacuations and created long-term exclusion areas. But the accidents were different. Fukushima was triggered by a massive earthquake and tsunami that destroyed power and cooling systems. Its reactors had containment structures, although hydrogen explosions damaged buildings and radioactive material escaped. Chernobyl involved an unstable reactor during a test, a violent power surge, destruction of the core, and an open graphite fire. The comparison matters because the phrase nuclear disaster can hide important differences. Learning requires precision. If every accident is treated as identical, the wrong lessons may be drawn. If every design difference is used to dismiss the possibility of catastrophe, another kind of blindness appears. The proper lesson is not that all reactors are the same. It is that every system must be examined for the ways it can fail, including the ways no one wants to imagine. Chernobyl also entered culture. Books, photographs, documentaries, games, television dramas, and personal testimonies carried the story to new generations. Some works brought forgotten experiences to global attention. Others blurred fact and fiction. The abandoned city became a destination for official tours. Visitors walked through empty schools, apartment blocks, and public buildings. They photographed the Ferris wheel in the amusement park, even though the park had not opened normally before the evacuation. They stood in places once filled with families and listened to dosimeters click. Tourism created its own tension. For some, visiting the zone was education and remembrance. For others, it became a search for dramatic images. A tragedy can be turned into scenery when the people who suffered disappear from the frame. Pripyat is visually powerful because it seems frozen, but the people were not frozen. They aged elsewhere. They built new lives. They raised children. They carried health fears, anger, nostalgia, and memories of a city that strangers later explored as a ruin. The most responsible way to look at Pripyat is not to ask only what happened to the buildings. It is to ask what happened to the people who once believed those buildings were home. Many myths grew around Chernobyl because the official story had been so incomplete. One of the most famous concerns a railway bridge where residents supposedly gathered to watch the fire and later all died. The location became known as the Bridge of Death. But evidence for the claim that everyone there died is weak. The story reflects real exposure and real fear, yet its most dramatic version cannot be treated as established fact. Another myth says that the 3 workers who drained water beneath the reactor died within days. They did not. Their action was dangerous, but the popular ending was invented or repeated without care. Some stories describe a nuclear explosion like an atomic bomb. That is also misleading. The reactor's destruction involved rapid power increase, ruptured fuel channels, steam explosions, fire, and chemical processes. It was not a nuclear weapon detonation. Other accounts claim that all life in the zone was destroyed forever. The return of forests and wildlife shows otherwise, though it does not prove the area is free of radiation risk. Correcting myths does not weaken the story. It respects the people who lived it. Chernobyl is powerful because it happened. The facts already contain a city emptied in hours, firefighters walking onto radioactive roofs, soldiers replacing failed robots, miners digging beneath a ruined reactor, scientists confronting political pressure, and hundreds of thousands of people mobilized to contain a disaster they could not see. Exaggeration can make history feel smaller by turning real people into legends. The truth keeps them human, and humanity is where the deepest fear lies. The operators in control room number 4 were not monsters. The firefighters were not invulnerable heroes. The residents of Pripyat were not foolish for trusting official reassurance. The scientists were not all courageous or all corrupt. The Soviet state was capable of both extraordinary mobilization and devastating dishonesty. Chernobyl was created by ordinary human weaknesses operating inside an extraordinary machine. Pressure, pride, fatigue, fear of failure, respect for authority, belief in systems, reluctance to admit the impossible has happened. These forces exist in every society. That is why Chernobyl remains more than a Soviet story. It is a warning for any institution that begins to believe its own machines cannot fail. The disaster can be measured in barriers that failed. The first barrier was the fuel itself. The second was the metal around it. The third was the reactor structure. The fourth should have been the building. But the most important barriers were not made of steel or concrete. They were decisions. A test could have been redesigned. A shutdown could have been postponed after the grid delay. The reactor could have been stopped when power collapsed. The test could have been canceled when the required control margin was lost. The emergency shutdown system could have been designed without a dangerous initial effect. Operators could have been warned clearly about low power instability. Earlier incidents could have been shared across the nuclear system. Regulators could have forced changes before another reactor entered the same condition. Any one of these barriers might have interrupted the chain. None did. This is the most unsettling part of Chernobyl. The accident did not require everyone to make the worst possible choice at the same moment. It required many smaller failures to align. Some were technical, some were organizational, some were political, Some were deeply human. The test procedure treated the reactor as a support system for an electrical experiment. The electrical grid delay changed the schedule. The night crew inherited a task under pressure. Xenon poisoning forced the reactor into unstable operation. Operators withdrew too many control rods. Protective signals were blocked. The reactor design amplified steam formation. The shutdown rods briefly increased reactivity. Then, in the final seconds, the system moved faster than human understanding. By the time the men in the control room saw the full danger, the reactor may already have passed beyond recovery. The AZ-5 button has become one of the most haunting symbols in industrial history. It was not labeled destruction. It was labeled emergency protection. The operator who pressed it did what operators are trained to do when a reactor becomes unstable: stop the chain reaction. But a hidden design flaw turned the act of protection into part of the catastrophe. There is a lesson in that reversal. A safety system is only as safe as the assumptions behind it. If designers imagine that a dangerous condition will never occur, they may build protection that fails precisely when it is needed most. The impossible condition at Chernobyl did not arrive from another planet. It was created by the reactor's own operating environment. When later investigators examined the sequence, they found that the machine had behaved according to physical laws. It was the human belief about those laws that had been wrong. Nature had not broken the rules. The rules written by people had failed to describe nature. After the explosion, the same pattern repeated in another form. Managers believed the reactor could not be destroyed, so evidence of destruction was dismissed. Officials believed panic was more dangerous than delayed information, so the public remained uninformed. The state believed it could control the story, so other countries learned the truth from radioactive fallout. Each false belief cost time. And at Chernobyl, time was measured in exposure. Minutes on a roof. Hours before medical treatment. A day and a half before evacuation. 2 days before public acknowledgement. Years before design responsibility was more fully recognized. Decades before a stronger confinement covered the ruins. The reactor exploded quickly. Truth arrived slowly. For the people closest to the accident, history was not an argument about statistics or reactor coefficients. It was a knock at the door. A husband who did not return from the night shift. A firefighter transferred to Moscow. A child placed on a bus. A village marked for evacuation. A military order sending a young man into the zone. A medical document listing a dose that may or may not have been accurate. A home visited years later under supervision. A photograph of Pripyat shown to children who had never seen the city alive. These experiences rarely fit into one official number. A death count matters. So does a life divided into before and after. Before Chernobyl, the milk was ordinary. After Chernobyl, it had to be measured. Before Chernobyl, rain meant spring. After Chernobyl, rain could bring fallout. Before Chernobyl, the power plant represented security. After Chernobyl, its silhouette meant exile. The disaster changed the meaning of familiar things. That transformation spread far beyond the exclusion zone. Across Europe, families watched weather reports and wondered where the plume would move. Farmers feared contaminated crops. Governments tested food. Parents kept children indoors. The public discovered that a nuclear accident could become international before a formal announcement crossed the border. Chernobyl made distance feel unreliable. A reactor in Ukraine could affect reindeer herders in Scandinavia. Rain could deposit contamination far from the plant. Political borders offered no protection. The peaceful atom had always been presented as a national achievement. Its failure became a shared problem. This helped change how nuclear emergencies were handled. International notification could no longer depend only on the willingness of the country where an accident occurred. Monitoring networks became more important. Cooperation became a necessity rather than a gesture. Still, agreements cannot guarantee honesty. In every crisis, leaders face the temptation to delay bad news until they understand it, control it, or make it less damaging. Chernobyl shows the danger of that instinct. The first public message does not need every answer. It needs enough truth to protect people. Uncertainty should not become an excuse for silence. Saying we do not yet know can be more responsible than pretending everything is under control. The Soviet response contained remarkable courage. It also contained avoidable exposure created by secrecy and confusion. Remembering only the failure would insult those who fought the disaster. Remembering only the heroism would excuse the system that placed them in danger. Both truths must remain together. The firefighters prevented conventional flames from spreading across the plant. The plant workers struggled through damaged corridors to manage water and equipment. The doctors treated injuries few had ever encountered. The helicopter crews flew above an open reactor. The miners dug beneath it. The liquidators cleared debris, buried soil, and built the shelter. Scientists mapped contamination and tried to understand fuel they could barely approach. Drivers evacuated a city. Families accepted strangers into homes and temporary settlements. These actions reduced the consequences of a disaster they had not created. But courage is not a safety system. A society should never rely on sacrifice as its final layer of protection. The highest honor owed to the liquidators is not only a medal or memorial. It is the refusal to build systems that require another generation of liquidators. Chernobyl's monuments often show firefighters, workers, or figures standing against the atom. Their faces are serious. Their bodies lean forward. The imagery presents a battle. In one sense, that is accurate. The cleanup was a battle against fire, contamination, time, weather, structural collapse, and incomplete knowledge. But the enemy was not the atom alone. The atom followed physics. The deeper enemy was a system that separated power from accountability. The reactor's dangerous characteristics were known in fragments. The operators received fragments. The public received fragments. The world received fragments. Chernobyl became catastrophic not only because the core was exposed, but because knowledge was contained more effectively than radiation. This is why the story still feels modern. Technology has grown more complex since 1986. Computer systems control finance, transportation, communication, medicine, weapons, and energy. Algorithms make decisions at speeds no human can follow. Supply chains cross continents. A failure in one place can spread globally. The temptation to trust complexity has grown with it. Experts may understand individual components while no one sees the whole system. Managers may focus on schedules and targets. Warnings may be buried inside technical language. Workers may fear the consequences of stopping production. Institutions may protect reputation by minimizing near misses. Chernobyl asks a question that applies to every powerful technology. What happens when the people responsible for safety are unable to challenge the people responsible for success? At Reactor Number 4, success meant completing the test. At the ministry, success meant maintaining production and confidence. At the state level, success meant preserving the image of control. Safety lost each competition until the reactor forced the truth into the sky. Even then, the first instinct was to preserve the image. There is another reason the story endures. Chernobyl does not provide a clean ending. Wars end with treaties. Regimes fall on dates written in textbooks. Disasters appear to end when the flames are extinguished. But Chernobyl continued. It continued in hospitals, in thyroid examinations, in compensation offices, in abandoned villages, in scientific studies, in the bodies and memories of liquidators, in the cracked fuel-containing materials beneath the shelter, in the budgets of independent Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, in the nuclear policies of countries thousands of kilometers away. In every photograph of Pripyat, the explosion was an event. Chernobyl became a condition. For former residents, anniversaries brought the city back. April 26th was not only a date in history. It was the night their lives separated. Some returned on organized visits and found apartments changed by decay and looting. Some searched for objects. Some stood outside buildings they could no longer enter safely. Memory competed with ruin. The city in their minds had lights, voices, music, buses, and children. The city before them had broken windows and trees growing through concrete. Visitors often described Pripyat as a place where time stopped. For its residents, time had never stopped. It had moved forward without their home. The word Chernobyl also changed over time. In Ukrainian, the place is more accurately rendered in English as Chernobyl, reflecting the Ukrainian name. For decades, the Russian-derived spelling Chernobyl became internationally dominant because the accident occurred within the Soviet Union and was reported through Russian-language structures. The difference in spelling can appear small, but names carry history. The plant stood in Ukraine. Ukrainian and Belarusian communities bore enormous consequences. The global memory of the disaster was shaped for years by a Soviet center that had controlled the first narrative. To remember the place accurately is to remember that Chernobyl was not an empty Soviet landscape. It was a Ukrainian region of towns, villages, forests, rivers, farms, graves, and families. The exclusion zone covered places with histories older than the power plant. The city of Chernobyl itself had existed for centuries. Pripyat was young, but the surrounding land was not. When maps colored the zone as contaminated territory, they could not show everything that had been removed from human life. A map can show cesium deposition. It cannot show attachment. It can show a 30-kilometer boundary. It cannot show the exact distance between a person and the home they miss. It can show population movement. It cannot show the moment someone understands that temporary evacuation has become permanent. The scientific and human maps overlap, but they are not the same. This is also true of the death toll. The number of immediate deaths is small enough to state with confidence. The number of later radiation-related deaths is estimated through models and studies. The number of lives damaged socially, psychologically, and economically is larger still and cannot be expressed by one medical category. Responsible history must resist two opposite temptations: claiming that every illness across a continent came from Chernobyl, or presenting uncertain stories as proven fact, using uncertainty to suggest that the disaster was less serious than it was. The honest position is harder. Some consequences are established clearly. Some are probable. Some remain disputed. Some cannot be measured completely. Uncertainty should sharpen moral responsibility, not erase it. When a government exposes people without warning and keeps inadequate records, later uncertainty is partly the result of the original failure. The absence of perfect data does not belong only to science. It belongs to history. By the time the new safe confinement covered reactor number 4, many of the people who had fought the first emergency were gone. Some had died from radiation injuries, some from unrelated illnesses, some from the ordinary passage of time. The arch stood because generations of workers, engineers, governments, and international donors accepted that the responsibility had not ended in 1986. Its smooth curve looked almost futuristic beside the aging plant. Beneath it remained the rough sarcophagus. Beneath that remained the shattered reactor. Layer upon layer. A modern shell over an emergency shelter over an industrial ruin over melted fuel. Each layer tells a different chapter. The reactor tells the story of design and operation. The sarcophagus tells the story of sacrifice and urgency. The arch tells the story of international responsibility and unfinished work. The silence around them tells the story of the city that left. On the morning after the explosion, Pripyat's residents could not imagine this future. They saw smoke. They heard rumors. They waited for officials to explain. Some washed balconies. Some prepared meals. Some took children outdoors. Some looked toward the station where relatives worked. Their trust was not irrational. Modern societies require trust. No citizen can independently inspect a reactor, measure every food product, or verify every emergency report. People depend on specialists and institutions. Chernobyl is often described as a failure of technology. It was also a failure of that necessary trust. Once broken, trust is difficult to rebuild because every later statement is judged against the first lie. When officials later offered reassuring health data, survivors remembered the delayed evacuation. When scientists explained that many doses were low, people remembered children drinking contaminated milk. When compensation systems demanded proof, liquidators remembered unreliable dosimeters. The original secrecy contaminated every later message. This may be Chernobyl's longest-lasting invisible fallout. Not iodine. Not cesium. Distrust. Radioactive iodine decays quickly. Cesium-137 declines over decades. Plutonium and other materials remain much longer in specific areas. But distrust can pass from parent to child without a measurable half-life. It shapes politics, medicine, science, and memory. The only treatment is honesty, and honesty works slowly. Nearly every person in the control room that night believed the reactor was manageable until it was not. Nearly every official involved in the first response believed information could be controlled until it crossed Europe. Nearly every resident of Pripyat believed the evacuation was temporary until the buses did not return. Chernobyl is filled with moments when one reality ended and another began. The fall in power to 30 megawatts. The decision to raise it. The start of the test. The press of AZ-5. The first explosion. The first firefighter stepping onto the roof. The first radiation measurement high enough to reveal the truth. The evacuation announcement. The alarm in Sweden. The moment the old explanation could no longer contain the evidence. History often looks inevitable after it happens. Chernobyl was not inevitable. That is what makes it a warning rather than only a tragedy. If the accident had been unavoidable, there would be little to learn. But it was built from choices, omissions, designs, incentives, and silences. Those can be changed. RBMK reactors were changed. Emergency agreements were changed. Training and international cooperation changed. The idea of safety culture gained global force. These changes came too late for Pripyat. But they prove that disaster can teach, if institutions are willing to accept a lesson that threatens their pride. 2340, on April 26, 1986, a button was pressed to shut down a reactor. Seconds later, the reactor exploded. That fact sounds like the ending of the story. It was only the beginning. The fire lasted days. The emergency lasted months. The cleanup lasted years. The displacement lasted lifetimes. The engineering task will continue for generations. And the question Chernobyl asks has never expired. How many warnings can a system hide before reality becomes impossible to hide? In the final photographs of the old plant, reactor number 4 no longer appears as it did after the explosion. The new arch covers the wound. From a distance, the structure can look calm, controlled, almost complete. But completion is an illusion. Inside are the remains of the night when the Soviet future broke open. Concrete that moved like paper. Graphite that burned beneath the sky. Fuel that melted into rooms below. Dust that crossed borders. And the evidence of a truth powerful enough to escape every attempt to contain it. Chernobyl is remembered as the place where a reactor exploded. It should also be remembered as the place where silence exploded with it. The first blast destroyed the machine. The second destroyed the belief that the system could never fail. And by the time the world understood what had happened, a city was empty. Thousands of lives had changed, and the future had inherited a ruin it did not create. History remembers the glow above reactor number 4. But the deepest darkness was not in the sky. It was in the space between what people knew and what they were allowed to say.